Wonderful. Great to see everyone here today. Amy Bergquist and myself will be presenting on the Convention Against Torture and the death penalty, particularly leveraging the Convention Against Torture to advocate for the abolition of the death penalty. I will give my colleague Amy Bergquist a quick moment to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Bergquist. I'm the Associate Program Director for the International Justice Program, and I just finished my third and term-limited final term as Vice President of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. And before I hand it off to my colleague Katia to get started, I'll say that the Advocates for Human Rights has its office in Minneapolis in Minnesota, but people might be joining from other parts of the country or other parts of the world. But yesterday was Indigenous Peoples Day, and I want to recognize that Minneapolis is the traditional and ancestral territory of the Dakota people, and we acknowledge the Dakota people as the traditional custodians of this land on which we meet, albeit virtually, and we pay our respect to Dakota elders past, present, and future. So Katia, why don't you lead us off?
Thank you, Amy. My name is Katia Galambos. I'm a program associate with the International Justice Program, as well as the Women's Human Rights Program, and we're excited to get started. So our agenda for today is we'll be doing a quick introduction to the Advocates for Human Rights, then talk more about the Convention Against Torture, in particular, a review process under the Convention Against Torture that states sign on to when they sign the convention, and then how we leverage that process to do advocacy towards abolition of the death penalty and on other death penalty issues with the Committee Against Torture. The Advocates for Human Rights has our mission statement up on the screen, and we work to implement these international human rights standards in many facets of our work. We have a program on international justice, which Amy and I are a part of, that works to promote the rule of law in the US and abroad by leveraging different mechanisms at the level of UN human rights. We have a special status called special consultative status, one of around 2,000 organizations which have this status in the world. And this allows us access to certain types of systems at the United Nations, which we can then leverage for different advocacy purposes. So for example, towards abolition of the death penalty. And this helps apply international pressure and show the United States and other countries around the world that the world is watching. We also have seen lots of success in using international human rights systems. So for example, we'll be talking about the Convention Against Torture to impact real laws in a particular country. And this works in congruence with social change in a country, and then change at the legal level and change through international human rights. So today is World Day Against the Death Penalty, which is why we are hosting this CLE. The death penalty theme for World Day Against the Death Penalty this year is death penalty and irreversible torture. And many organizations all over the world and individuals are hosting events to commemorate this day and advocate for abolition of the death penalty and other death penalty issues, work on them. So if you would like to learn more about World Day Against the Death Penalty, I will paste a link in the chat briefly. And for now, I will pass it off to Amy to talk more about the Convention Against Torture.
Thanks, Katya. And we're also a part of this network, this coalition. And I was up at 6 a.m. for the first of the World Day Against Death Penalty events that was scheduled virtually. That was a meeting between the European Union and the African Union to focus on a protocol under the African Charter of Human and People's Rights to abolish the death penalty. There's a draft protocol in the works, so that was really exciting. And we're part of the global campaign today. So the Convention Against Torture is a treaty, and It's a human rights treaty, and if we can go on to the next slide, you can see that it's a relatively well accepted treaty. The blue countries on the map are the ones that are state parties to the treaty, meaning they've ratified it or acceded to it. It entered into force in 1987. And there's just a handful of countries that aren't parties to the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, which is the full name of the treaty. So it's one of the few treaties the United States has ratified as well. So that means that what we're going to talk about in terms of the treaty body review process also applies to the United States, which is really nice. So it is a convention, and we'll take a look first at the definition of torture. That's Article 1 of the Convention Against Torture. And if you take a look at this, I've underlined certain passages. An act, torture is an act by which severe pain or suffering, so it has to be severe, and it can be mental or physical. It doesn't have to be physical alone, and some of us don't necessarily think about that torture can be mental, and it has to be intentionally inflicted for a variety of purposes. It could be to obtain a confession, it could be to punish someone, it could be to intimidate someone, or it could be simply based on discrimination. We're going to torture you because you're a woman or because you're a member of a particular racial group. When the suffering or pain is inflicted by or at the instigation of or with the consent or acquiescence of a public official. So it can be a public official doing it, meaning police officer carrying out an interrogation or a prison warden, but it could also be with the consent of the government official. So it could be a third party doing it, but with the government's consent, or it could be that the government is acquiescing to it. And so this is where we think about, for example, gender-based violence and domestic violence. If the government repeatedly looks the other way when there's domestic violence, when a person is being battered by their intimate partner, that can also rise to the level of torture as well. And the committee has specified that. And it means the person acting in their official capacity, as we would expect under US law as well. The interesting part of this definition is the second sentence in Article 1, Paragraph 1. It does not include pain or suffering arising only from, inherent in, or incidental to lawful sanctions. So if you're thinking about the death penalty to torture, you may think, well, why are we even talking about that then? The death penalty is a lawful sanction in countries that authorize the death penalty. Isn't that excluded under this definition from even talking about it? And it's a really interesting legal question. And there was a position paper just released today by our friends at FIACOT, and I'll put a link to that in the chat because it looks at this very question about, how we whether we can consider the death penalty to be a form of torture given this definition. And it's really interesting. One of the arguments I thought was really compelling is we have international human rights standards that, for example, say that while you can certainly punish someone for committing a crime, you can't dismember them for committing a crime. You can't chop off their hands for theft, for example. That is a form of torture, and that's sort of a globally accepted definition. So if we can't impose corporal punishment on people, whether it's flogging or amputation or things like that, if we can't have corporal punishment as punishment for a crime and that amounts to torture, then the death penalty also seems like a form of corporal punishment, sort of the most extreme form of corporal punishment. And so that, if you read the position paper that I put in the chat, it goes into that argument in more detail as to why we can consider, even with this definition of torture, we can consider the death penalty itself to be a form of torture. But it's not a resolved issue at the moment. So I'm just reading a message here. Okay, let me try again to put the link in the chat. Okay, I'll try again. Hopefully this will get to everyone. All right, so that's our definition of torture. And so you might think, well, the committee that's in charge of interpreting this definition might shy away from taking on the death penalty, but fortunately for us in our advocacy, that's not the case. We're able to engage on death penalty issues with the Committee Against Torture. Before we dive into that advocacy, though, let's take a little bit deeper look at what the treaty itself says. So we can go on to the next slide, please. So the treaty mainly spells out what are the obligations of a government that has ratified this treaty. They have to prevent torture. There's a concept of non-refoulement, which is really important in the United States if you practice immigration law, because you have an obligation under the Convention Against Torture not to return someone to a country where they would face a risk of being tortured. So that's the non-refoulement obligation. States have to criminalize torture. They have to either prosecute people who have committed torture or extradite them to a place where they may be prosecuted. They have to train law enforcement. They have to conduct prompt and impartial investigations, establish a complaint mechanism whereby people who have been subjected to torture can bring their complaints. They have to provide redress for victims, provide support for victims of torture and or their descendants if the victim is deceased. They have to exclude evidence obtained via torture and prevent cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment as well under Article 16. So those are the main state party obligations. We can go on to the next slide, please, Katya. Great. And then the following articles under the treaty set out sort of how we go about implementing the treaty. Article 17 establishes a committee of 10 experts called the Committee Against Torture. They are elected by the countries that have ratified it. So if a country has ratified the convention, then they get to get in on voting for who will be the experts. They have geographical diversity and they're independent. They're not supposed to represent the country that they come from. In fact, if the country they come from is engaging with the committee, they recuse themselves just in case there might be some appearance of lack of impartiality. Then under Article 19, if a country is a party to the treaty, they have to submit reports on what they've done to give effect to what their obligations are under the convention. So they're supposed to do an initial report, and then every 4 years, they're supposed to submit a supplementary report to say, here's what we're doing to undertake our obligations under the treaty. And so I call that the sort of self-audit. Here's how we're doing. And then the committee experts take a look at that report, and then they can make their own comments and give observations and, most importantly, recommendations for what a country should do better to implement its obligations under the treaty. We'll talk in a little bit more detail shortly about that procedure and how organizations like the Advocates for Human Rights and the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty get involved in that process. There's also an inquiry procedure if there are grave and systematic violations of the Convention Against Torture. And there are communications. So if an individual feels that their rights have been violated, if their government has opted into this procedure, then you can bring kind of like a mini lawsuit, a communication to the committee experts to say, here's this instance in which my rights have been violated. So we can move on to the next slide, please. So there's this periodic review process that I alluded to. And this is how the Advocates has primarily engaged with the Committee Against Torture to advocate for abolition of the death penalty. As part of this process, as you saw in the slide 2 slides ago, the states have an obligation to do their self-audit, and then the committee experts do an examination. And this is sort of the overall cycle of the periodic reporting process. Step 1 in the cycle is the state party submits a report. At step 2, the committee looks at the report and comes up with a list of questions or issues. They'll request additional information. Then the government will reply to that list of issues. Then the government sends a delegation to Geneva. That's at step 4, and they have what they call a constructive dialogue between the committee experts and the government representatives. That typically lasts for about 6 hours of back and forth Q&A. And then a few weeks later, the committee experts, this is step 5, will issue their concluding observations, including recommendations about what the state should be doing going forward. And then that basically 4-year period before the next report is implementation. The state party is expected to implement the recommendations that the committee experts make. Now, the implementation is sometimes imperfect, but it's at least a step forward. And as Katya suggested, our partners have told us that this type of procedure, that this engagement with experts on human rights in Geneva is in many cases an effective way to press governments to respect human rights or to improve their human rights record. There is, in addition to this standard reporting procedure, the committees have come up with a simplified or expedited reporting procedure that just basically skips a couple of the steps. Rather than the state having to do an initial self-audit, going over all of its obligations and what it's done over the past 4 or so years, Instead, the committee starts straight away with a list of issues, and they call it a list of issues prior to reporting, to say, here are the things we'd like information from you, and then the state provides a written reply that constitutes a state party report. And then after that written reply is submitted, again, they have that constructive dialogue, the 6-hour session between the government representatives and the independent experts on the committee. Again, you have concluding observations and recommendations, and you also have follow-up. So it's just a little bit more streamlined procedure, and not all governments go through the streamlined procedure. As you'll see, some of them use the simplified reporting procedure, and some use the standard reporting procedure, and we'll give you some examples of that. So how do we do advocacy within this system? So we'll show you those same cycles again, and you'll see when there are civil society opportunities. And we're really thankful to our pro bono partners who make this advocacy possible. We have the Advocates has great pro bono support, and we have a lot of pro bono attorneys. I hope some of you are here today who help us with drafting these reports. So after the state party submits its report, then we get a chance to submit our own report that's designed to try to influence the committee experts in their list of issues and questions. So we're trying to help the committee experts set the agenda. And in this case, we want to make sure that death penalty issues are on that agenda. So that's our first civil society reporting opportunity between steps 1 and 2. Then, after you have the government's response to that agenda, response to the list of issues and questions, we get a chance again to intervene to say, okay, we're going to fact check what the government said, or the government skipped over this question or didn't really respond here. We get another chance to submit a report before that constructive dialogue happens in Geneva. So that's between steps 3 and 4. In the expedited process, we also have 2 different opportunities for reporting. First is before the committee creates its list of issues prior to reporting. We, again, help shape that agenda. And then after the government replies to the list of issues prior to reporting, we, again, submit a report to offer our responses. We call that a shadow report or an alternative report. To, again, feed information to the committee experts so that when they have the constructive dialogue in Geneva, the committee experts have all the information at their fingertips, know where they should be pressing and what sort of questions they should be asking and where they shouldn't take the government's word for what the government delegation is saying. It's also super helpful if we can be on the ground in Geneva to watch in real time when that review is happening. As Katya will show you, it's also live webcast on UN Web TV. But if we're there on the ground and we hear something that's not quite right, or the government is skirting an issue or something, we can go up to the committee experts during a break and say, hey, here's the real deal, here's what's going on. And we'll oftentimes hear follow-up questions come in the next round of discussion in that process. So it really can be effective. We're going to focus here on our submission of reports in the procedure, so we won't focus on the on-the-ground advocacy we're able to do in Geneva. And when we're writing these reports, our main target is, of course, those committee experts, because they're the ones we want asking questions and making recommendations and adding the death penalty to the list of issues that they're going to be considering. So those treaty body experts, those 10 people, are our main audience, but we also want the government of the state that's going through the review to be part of our audience. We want them to know, here are the issues, here are our concerns, and then the general public, especially when we're working with partner organizations, they will often use our reports as a way to educate the public. We're doing it right now. We're educating all of you about the advocacy that we've done with the Committee Against Torture as well. So there are multiple audiences, but the primary audience, the people we are most eager to persuade, are those experts who serve on the Committee Against Torture. So now we're going to jump into do the deep dive into 3 examples of recent advocacy we've done approximately over the past year or so with the Committee Against Torture. And we're going to start with Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is following that traditional procedure, not the expedited procedure. So you'll see that as we talk about our advocacy. Ethiopia is what we'd call has a de facto moratorium on executions. Its most recent execution was in 2007. So quite a while ago, yet Ethiopian courts continue to sentence people to death. In 2022, there were at least 5 death sentences, no executions, of course, and no known death sentences in 2019, 2020. There were 2 or more in 2021. And that's another problem we have with Ethiopia and with a lot of countries There's not a lot of transparency about how many death sentences they have issued. So when we say 5+, as we know about 5 definitely, and there could be more that just aren't reported because there's not a lot of journalistic freedom, freedom of the press and reporting to the public in Ethiopia, as is the case in a lot of other countries. We know that there are approximately 124 people on death row, including 2 women. And I'll show you soon how we know that. We didn't know that before this review process started. And one of the important standards for the death penalty that you'll see in terms of what the committee says is that the death penalty should be, if to the extent a country has the death penalty, it should be limited to the most serious crimes. And that's been defined by another one of these treaty bodies to mean a crime in which the person to be sentenced to death committed a killing and intended to kill. So if you're familiar with the felony murder rule from law school, not permissible under those circumstances to subject someone to the death penalty if they were not themselves the trigger person. And it has to involve an intentional killing. In Ethiopia, where this is particularly problematic, is where Ethiopia authorizes the death penalty for terrorism-related offenses, and is the case in Ethiopia as it is in the case of a lot of other countries. Terrorism is defined very broadly and can be interpreted as basically criticizing the government or protesting against the government. And so people who speak out against the government in Ethiopia are at risk of being labeled terrorists and prosecuted as terrorists and then being sentenced to death. Now, interestingly, under Ethiopia's federal Supreme Court, they have a sentencing manual that says that the death penalty should only be used for the most serious criminal offenses that have been committed by exceptionally dangerous criminals and without any extenuating circumstance. So it's definitely not mandatory, and it's supposed to be limited to, as they would say, the worst of the worst. But we'll see that that's not actually the case. So now we can move with that overview of the death penalty in Ethiopia. We can move on to where we engaged in advocacy. And we engaged in advocacy at both of these stages, first after the state party submitted its report, and then after we had the state party's responses to the list of issues. So first, let's look at that state party report and what the Ethiopian government said about the death penalty in its official report. And you'll see, if we go on to the next slide, Katya, you'll see they're referencing back to the previous cycle concerning the committee's recommendation pertaining to imposition of the death penalty. So this was paragraph 24 of the previous cycle's concluding observations and recommendations. The committee had recommended that Ethiopia abolish the death penalty or consider abolishing the death penalty. And the response to the government here is that, as the committee noted in the concluding observations, the Supreme Court during this reporting period issued sentencing guidelines, as I just went over, limiting the death penalty purportedly to the worst of the worst. And they said thus, although as of April 2019, there have been so many people on death row, no one has been executed since the last report, which is a good thing. And people have been pardoned and released from prison during the reporting period. So they're saying, here's an update about our death penalty position in Ethiopia. So we submitted a report to try to influence the list of issues. And I'm not going to go over all our report, but what you have here in paragraph 26, this is the agenda that the experts have set. And we have a lot of topics related to the death penalty in this one paragraph. A lot of them are pulled directly from the report that we submitted. So we were saying, hey, committee, please pay attention to these death penalty issues. So they asked about measures taken to ensure the death penalty is imposed only for the most serious crimes. Is the state party considering abolishing the death penalty? What efforts have you made to commute death sentences? What about detention conditions for people who are under sentence of death? Have you taken any steps to strengthen legal safeguards and guarantees of due process in capital cases? And please tell us the precise number of death sentences that you've passed over the past reporting period, like since the last review. So they're asking for a lot of really good information, some of which we were eager to get because we couldn't find, because there's not transparency, there's not a lot of public disclosure of that information within Ethiopia. So then we move on to Ethiopia's replies to the list of issues. So in reply to that paragraph, and you can see it's directly saying in relation to paragraph 26, we have this sentencing manual. And again, they like to trot out that sentencing manual because that's very typical. They'll point to, okay, we have this really good law, we have this really good policy in place. And then they gave data as of November 2022. There are this many people on death row, 122 men, 2 women, so numbers have gone down. And it says all the convicts have been found guilty and sentenced to death inter alia for aggravated homicide. Now, if you know inter alia, that means among other things for aggravated homicide, and we'll take a look at that. But it was really great because the committee had asked about it. The Ethiopian government complied and submitted an annex with all the people under sentence of death. And this was information we did not have before, and it's super useful. Now we have the names of all of the people under sentence of death as of November 2022. And we found out the names of the 2 women who were under sentence of death, which we didn't know before. We found out for some of them, the court that issued the sentence, the date of the decision, and where they're being held, which really opens the door for doing prison visits to find out more details about their cases. And you'll see that inter alia for aggravated homicide, well, the first woman on the list was sentenced to death just for homicide, not aggravated homicide. And so that really calls into question whether these are the worst of the worst, if they had the option of charging someone with aggravated homicide and she was charged only with homicide, and yet she was still sentenced to death. So sometimes it comes up like facially, the information that the government presents shows that what the government is telling the committee experts, that the death penalty is only for the most serious criminal offenses, is obviously not true. So we can go on to the next slide. More responses to the list of issues says that people on death row are held in maximum security facilities and provided with the same humane treatment as other prisoners. We can call that into question if we know about prison practices in Ethiopia. And then finally, the Ethiopian government offers some justification for why it retains the death penalty. And it says, it is believed that the general consensus of the public is not toward abolishing the death penalty, but we have a draft criminal procedure and evidence code providing that if a person isn't actually executed within 2 years, their death penalty will be commuted to life imprisonment. Now, of course, that's a draft law, and that's another thing we frequently see in the treaty body processes. Governments will talk about all the draft laws they have that are really, really good, and then there's no evidence that they're actually adopted. So that's what we heard in response to the list of issues. And of course, we're not going to leave it there. We had another chance to submit a report. And so we submitted our second report in March of this year. And then we had the constructive dialogue between the committee experts and the government officials. And this is what we had as sort of the end result, the concluding observations and recommendations that the treaty body experts made after they met with the government officials. So we can go on to the next slide, Katya. So this is sort of the prefatory language. We note the de facto moratorium on the death penalty since 2007. We remain concerned about the death penalty being available for less serious crimes that don't involve intentional killing, like terrorism-related offenses, which was a big part of our report. So it was great to hear that. They're also concerned about information received, meaning received from the Advocates for Human Rights and the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, that death sentences are often accompanied by a lack of due process and fair trial guarantees. So this is coming out of the official experts' mouths as sort of their final report card for the government of Ethiopia, and reports that death row inmates face conditions of detention that amount to ill treatment. Again, that was another topic we covered in our report. So that's the first paragraph 48 in the concluding observations and recommendations. And then we get to what they recommend to the government of Ethiopia. The state party should, we're using stronger language here, revise its legislation, including the law about terrorism, to make sure that the death penalty is imposed only for the most serious crimes, understood to be crimes involving intentional killing. So those vaguely defined terrorism offenses should not be authorized, should not have the death penalty as a possible penalty. Then consider abolishing the death penalty and formalizing the moratorium and commute death penalty sentences to life imprisonment, ensure that conditions of detention don't amount to cruel, inhuman, degrading punishment, and strengthen legal safeguards and ensure access to free legal aid. That was another issue that we recommended. And consider becoming a party to the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is the treaty that countries can ratify saying that they have abolished the death penalty and are committed to being bound by that going forward. So that is sort of a wrap up of what we've done with Ethiopia. More to come to see whether the government will in fact implement those recommendations. And now I'll hand it off to Katya to talk about Egypt.
Thank you, Amy. So Egypt ranks in the top 5 countries. It's number 4 for the number of executions after China, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, and then one before the United States. And from January 2020 to March 2022, Egypt executed at least 230 people. And this year there have been executions as recently as June 14th. So a wide range of offenses are eligible for the death penalty. Egypt frequently sentences people to death in mass trials, which carries high due process concerns where defendants don't truly receive an independent trial, as they might be looped in with co-defendants and don't have adequate access to counsel. And civilians might be tried in military courts where they don't have the same protections. And then lastly, there's widespread use of torture to extract confessions and insufficient investigations into torture, particularly investigations into torture committed by the National Security Agency. So we wanted to be involved with our partners and submit reports to provide information when there was an opportunity for Egypt to come up under review. So the concluding observations were established or last published in 2002. And that report did not mention the death penalty, but it did mention conditions of detention and torture for all people in detention, not just people who had been sentenced to death. And especially since the death penalty is such a big issue, we are hoping that we can influence the concluding observations for the next review of Egypt. So in 2010, Egypt began that cycle again. It seemed like they're going to be going with the simplified reporting procedure by submitting a list of issues prior to reporting, which is the upper graphic on the right of the slide. And in this report, this list of issues prior to reporting report, the committee did ask Egypt to provide information on the death penalty, including the number of offenses that carry the death penalty and data on cases. So now the next expected step in the reporting procedure would be for Egypt to submit a reply to the LOI answering the questions provided in the LOI PR. But it never submitted a reply to the LOI, and they instead submitted a state party report in September 2021, entering back into that standard reporting procedure, which is quite unusual. And this might have something to do with the fact that there was widespread political uprising in 2011. Egypt actually elected a president in 2012, and his party abolished the constitution. Or actually it reinstated a new constitution, they attacked the independence of the judiciary, lots of changes happened. And then in 2014, after more political change, there was another constitution put into place. So now Egypt is operating from a different legal framework. So I can see why they wanted to restart the reporting procedure again with the new legal framework that they have. So Egypt did submit a state party report in 2021, but it was not responsive to that LOI PR in the way it normally would have been. So it didn't provide data on the death penalty. And so we actually re-entered into this process that began again in 2021, which was, many years after the 2002 concluding observations. And we created a suggested list of issues to give to the committee. Amy, would you be able to put that link in the chat? Okay. And the committee published its list of issues in 2023. So we had submitted the suggested list of issues with the purpose of suggesting to the committee what issues they can ask Egypt about related to DP and getting the death penalty in as a topic for this reporting cycle. And we submitted this report alongside Reprieve and the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. Reprieve is based in the UK, but has lots of information about conditions on the ground and actually represents clients dealing with human rights violations related to the death penalty or torture. And the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, which us and Reprieve are members. And the committee did mention the death penalty in its LOI, which is the paragraph on the right. So we can speculate that they took our suggested LOI into account. So here's a little deeper dive into those paragraphs in the committee's LOI. So in our suggested LOI, we asked for disaggregated data by sex and age, and they included that it should be disaggregated by sex and age, the crime of conviction, and the committee did say the data should include the crimes for which those sentences were handed down, We put sentencing authority, and they said, yeah, the specifying the courts responsible for those convictions. And then any appeals or petitions for clemency and pardon, in the committee then input information about, or then ask for information about in which a pardon or a commutation was granted, which is fantastic. Then Egypt submitted a reply in response to the committee's LOI. This report was available in Arabic, but there's no official translation. So here is the text with the caveat that it is not official. In order to abolish, basically they say it requires studying how it will impact victims and their families, and how abolition could impact rates of serious crimes. And for us, we know that the death penalty does not have a deterrent effect. There's no evidence that it has a deterrent effect. And notice how Egypt said it requires these studies, but they did not say we're going to plan these studies, or we did plan these studies and we're carrying them out in this timeline. Like, this is just, from my end, it seems like it's very much just an excuse without the steps taken. And in addition, they said something very interesting. They said the death penalty is only imposed for the most serious crimes, in line with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, who sets that standard, which is an intentional killing. But Egypt does allow the death penalty for offenses like terrorism and espionage, which may not result in death. Then this last section here with the underline says the death penalty is a judicial and legislative issue that falls within the scope of states' sovereignty in determining the criminal justice system. And this is a very common argument that we've seen Egypt and other states make. So we tried to address the state sovereignty issue in the next opportunity we had, which was a shadow report. As Amy mentioned earlier, we have the opportunity to provide information to the committee in advance of both the list of issues and in advance of the concluding observations, in which the committee will make recommendations for a country to implement. So we've provided the committee with more information and suggested recommendations. And in this next report, we included more information about that state sovereignty argument and more information about gender. So I'm going to pass to Amy to talk more about the state sovereignty argument.
Sure. And I see from the participants list that Matthew Goldberg is here. He's the president of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, and he has been very active in efforts to combat this very bad argument on state sovereignty that we see trotted out. We saw it every October, November of even numbered years. The UN General Assembly has a vote on a resolution calling for a worldwide moratorium on executions. And there are certain governments, including Egypt and particularly Singapore, that try to fight not only the resolution as a whole, but get inserted into the resolution language about state sovereignty. We also see this, and every fall, the Human Rights Council has a resolution relating to the death penalty. So this is going on right now as we speak in Geneva. And again, there are efforts from countries that retain the death penalty to try to insert into an anti-death penalty resolution language about state sovereignty. And the argument, horrible as it is, goes like this: like, we are sovereign states, and sovereign states have the right to determine what behavior is criminalized and what the penalties for such criminal behavior should be. And they refer to this as sovereign rights, or the rights of sovereign states. And they attempt to connect it to the United Nations Charter. However, the United Nations Charter, when it talks about sovereignty, is talking about the concept of sovereign equality. And what that means in the UN Charter is that each sovereign, each independent country is equal, whether it's a small country like Jamaica or a large country like China. Each country gets the same number of votes in the General Assembly, and each country has equal footing. That's the concept of sovereign equality. It doesn't really have anything to do with the government's right to decide what behavior is going to be criminalized and what the penalties will be. And of course, it is true that governments have the right to decide what behavior is criminalized and what the penalty should be. But that concept of sovereignty is not to be used as a shield against discussion of human rights. Because we wouldn't say if a government criminalizes apostasy, if it says it's a crime and we will punish you with, some severe penalty for believing in a religion other than the official religion of the state, we wouldn't say, oh, that's a matter of the sovereign right of the state to decide that. No, we would say that's a human rights violation. We would say that it's a violation to the right of freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and we would have a conversation then about why that is problematic. Same if a government criminalizes defamation. That there would be a conversation then about how that law that the government chose to adopt to criminalize defamation and to have criminal penalties for it, how that violates human rights in terms of freedom of expression. So it seems uniquely attracted to issues of the death penalty that governments will trot this issue out about state sovereignty. They don't talk about it in the context of these other acts of criminalizing certain conduct and determining what the penalties are, but they trot out this argument of state sovereignty in the context of these UN debates on resolutions, but we also see it here engaging with a treaty body. And this is what I'm really excited to see what will happen in the review, because the treaty body experts, I suspect, aren't going to have a lot of patience for Egypt's reliance on the state sovereignty argument as sort of this excuse or justification for retaining the death penalty. Because yes, Egypt can decide what penalties to have. But yes, the treaty body experts of interpreting a treaty that Egypt chose to ratify can also say this is a violation of your human rights obligations. So I'm really hopeful that the experts on the treaty body will push back on Egypt in its reliance on the state sovereignty argument. But we could have a whole hour-long CLE about this topic, and I know Matthew would have a lot more expertise than I do on it because he's deep in the weeds of all of the negotiations. But this is an issue we see a lot in the international community when countries oppose abolition of the death penalty or support the use of the death penalty. They will trot out the state sovereignty argument. I'll hand back to Katya to talk about gender issues.
Thank you, Amy. So we also included a section on gender that we didn't include at the list of issues stage. Because at the list of issues stage, the committee asked Egypt to report on measures taken to prevent and combat all forms of violence against women, including domestic violence and sexual violence. And the report also asked about marital rape, honor crimes, and female genital mutilation. So while the Committee Against Torture does not specifically mention a gendered perspective, the definition of torture and in the convention can be applied to domestic violence and I guess FGM and other forms of torture, and therefore state parties to the Convention Against Torture have legal obligations regarding preventing and prosecuting such crimes. And these forms of torture are very deeply gendered, like domestic violence is very deeply gendered. So the Convention Against Torture concerns itself with this form of torture that has a specific population that it impacts more acutely. And the death penalty does impact women in a very specific way. Authorizing the death penalty for murder, for example, might seem gender neutral on paper, but in practice, on a global scale, women are sentenced to death for murder most often in the context of prolonged domestic violence, which is a form of violence based on gender. And the criminal system, which I'd argue of any country, but including of Egypt, is not adequately trained on gender sensitivity. For example, judges and prosecutors may not consider gender-based violence as a mitigating circumstance for crimes committed in that context. And women may also be sentenced to death without considering the gender dynamics between the woman and male co-defendants. So like women are sometimes sentenced to death for a crime that their husband or their intimate partner commits. And then the sentence reflects this stereotype that women are essentially extensions of their husband's will. And we see that issue a lot. And also one of our wonderful partners, the Cornell Center on the Death Penalty Worldwide, have documented that women are sentenced more harshly when they do not adhere to gender stereotypes and norms. So as the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary and arbitrary executions puts it, courts judge women not just for their alleged offenses, but also for what are perceived to be their moral failings as women. Nowhere are transgressions of the social norms of gender behavior punished more severely than in a capital trial. So we wanted to add this perspective to the committee's information, as Egypt does have women on death row. And there is data available that between January 2011, which is still within the reporting period because the last concluding observations was so long ago in 2002, and up until December 2020, that Egyptian authorities sentenced 168 women to death, almost all of them for murder, and sentenced 47 women to death in 2022 alone. So these legal proceedings that are not adequately gender sensitive might not take into account an accused woman's experiences of gender-based violence or power dynamics between accused woman and her male co-defendants. So now that we've put that before the committee, we're hoping to see what will happen when the committee issues its concluding observations. So during this upcoming 78th session of the Committee Against Torture, the committee is going to have a dialogue and review Egypt basically on this date. It's actually Tuesday on November 14th and Wednesday on November 15th. And you can watch that session live in the link that Amy put on the chat, UN Web TV. You can navigate that website and watch it live. It's broadcast. And then in the coming weeks after that, the committee will issue its concluding observations, and we'll be able to say, what did they engage, how did they engage with this issue of state sovereignty, and did they include any specific mention of gender? And this 21-year gap between the 2002 concluding observations and the ones that they'll issue in a couple of weeks in late 2023 or early 2024, really shows that it's important to advocate and get abolition of the death penalty on the agenda. But because it happens so infrequently, but hopefully the next reporting procedure will be much quicker in the next cycle and not take 21 years. Now pass on to Amy to talk about Uganda.
Thanks, Katya. So traveling a little bit farther south from Egypt, Uganda has more than 28 crimes that are punishable by death. It's the highest number of capital offenses in East Africa, something we noted in our report. And most recently in this year, Ugandan authorities passed a law authorizing the death penalty for what they called aggravated homosexuality. So this is actually expanding the scope of the death penalty and expanding it, of course, in a discriminatory manner. There has been progress with a ruling from the Ugandan Supreme Court in the Kagula case, striking down the mandatory death penalty. And the mandatory death penalty is something we see in a lot of countries. So that's no longer applicable in Uganda. In that decision, they said that violated human rights, violated the Constitution. And that decision also said that if somebody isn't executed within 3 years of being sentenced to death, that the Constitution requires that sentence be commuted to life imprisonment. So that was a great ruling, pushed by litigated by some of our colleagues on the in the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. Uganda hasn't carried out an execution in quite some time. The most recent execution was in 2005. That was in a military case, but the most recent civilian execution was 1999, quite some time ago. No new death sentences in 2022, so that's really promising. There were 2 in 2021, but really just a handful of death sentences over the past 5 years. But there are currently at least 135 people under sentence of death, 11 of whom were women as of 2018. And again, this is a country where we don't have completely precise information about the number of people under sentence of death. We'll get into that a little bit more later. In January of 2018, President Museveni threatened to resume executions. There was sort of this uptick in crime, and as politicians are wont to do, they say, I have the easy answer, we'll start executing people. They haven't done so, but that was a threat that was trotted out in 2018. I mentioned this General Assembly resolution vote that happens in the fall of even-numbered years. Uganda had habitually voted against the resolution, but changed its vote in last year, changed to voting in favor of the resolution calling for a worldwide moratorium on execution. So that was a really promising sign. So we're getting kind of mixed signals, 2018 to 2022. Maybe we're moving in the right direction. Then 2023, we had the Anti-Homosexuality Act. So we're not quite sure what to think about that, but we do have our partner organization, Foundation for Human Rights Initiative, based in Uganda. They do great work, and we work with them to submit a report. You can go on to the next slide, Katya. To the Committee Against Torture when it was preparing to review Uganda's human rights record last year. We didn't engage at the list of issues stage, only at the later stage in the cycle, but you'll see that that engagement had good results nonetheless. So we can move forward to these are the concluding observations and recommendations that the Committee Against Torture issued to Uganda. They noted some good things, referencing the Kagula decision, that the death penalty is no longer mandatory and now is subject to the discretion of the judges, which is really promising. And that according to information the government provided, if after 3 years a person has been sentenced to death and they haven't been executed, the death sentence is deemed commuted to life imprisonment. So they put that in the record to make it official, like this is what we understood that you said. We're really happy about that. And then they observed that the penal code has 8 sections with offenses that may be punished by death, and 28 offenses under the various laws are punishable by death. We regret that. This is where things get a little tense. This is the committee experts being critical. The language is not consistent across that legislation, and there's not detailed and disaggregated data on the number of individuals under sentence of death during the reporting period. And that's something we as civil society members really want to push these experts to do, is get that information, extract that information from the government experts, give us this data, publish it on a regular basis. So then we move on to the next paragraph, which is the recommendations part of the concluding observations and recommendations. And here it's a little bit more diplomatically worded. The committee invites the state party to do these various things. So there are 5 recommendations specific to the death penalty, and we'll talk about 3 of them here, and then we'll talk in a little bit, we'll take a closer look at the other 2. Take appropriate steps to ensure the death sentences for everyone who's been on death row for 3 years are commuted to prison terms, as the Supreme Court said you need to do. Consider reducing the number of capital offenses, and consider ratifying the second optional protocol aiming at abolition of the death penalty. But now we'll take a look at B and C to see how our advocacy seems to have influenced. You can judge for yourself. Did we influence what came out of the concluding observations and recommendations? We said provide annual disaggregated data, and you can read what's on the screen there. And it's almost word for word in subparagraph B what they put in their recommendations. And I particularly want to emphasize, Katya was talking about issues of women and gender. We want that disaggregated data identifying the gender of the people under sentence of death. And also, and this was a huge victory for us, relationship to the victims. Because we also know that women can be sentenced to death for killing their spouse or their intimate partner. And that information otherwise isn't apparent. But if we make the government put it in their annual reports, it will be there, and we can do that analysis, and we can do better advocacy because we have the government statistics in front of us. So that's super helpful to have that from the Torture Committee. And we know that our partners at Foundation for Human Rights Initiative, who do these prison visits and who are doing a fact-finding project on women under sentence of death, they are going to be able to go to the government with this recommendation to say, look, the Committee Against Torture said you need to do this. Where is your annual disaggregated data? We're waiting for it. We'll give you a table to fill in. This is all the information we want. And that really opens the door for them to do great advocacy in the country. Now we'll look at that subparagraph C. Improve that Foundation for Human Rights Initiative provides legal assistance to people under sentence of death or at risk of being sentenced to death. So we wanted a recommendation to improve the quality of legal assistance for people who are charged with capital offenses and people who are sentenced to death in collaboration with civil society organizations, because we were meaning by that Foundation for Human Rights Initiative. We want to have the committee experts make the government of Uganda collaborate with Foundation for Human Rights Initiative, including to increase funding to them so they can do better work. And lo and behold, the recommendation is almost identical to what we had asked for: improve the quality of legal assistance in collaboration with civil society organizations, including through enhanced funding and expanded training. So that was really exciting to see the Committee Against Torture take up those recommendations. with that, we will wrap up on Uganda, and we'll talk briefly about 3 other countries that we've done advocacy with the Committee Against Torture over the past year or so. And these are just excerpts of what we put in our report and what the committee said in what its next document was. So with respect to the Maldives, which has had a de facto moratorium on executions for quite some time, but we viewed it as a country at risk. We were particularly alarmed a couple of years ago when they started to build new execution facilities. And so we suggested a question to the Committee Against Torture. If you're committed to upholding a moratorium, which the government had said it was, what are you planning to do with the execution facilities that you're building? And the Committee Against Torture picked up that. Please specify the intended use for the execution facilities recently constructed on the territory. So that was great to see. The committee is saying, you know, we have our eyes on you. We know that you're doing this. What's going on? So that's a great way to put some pressure on the government of the Maldives about that. Tunisia, looking for, again, disaggregated data, getting that information. We have great partners in Tunisia as part of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. We suggested that they should ask about data on people under sentence of death, and that's what the committee asked for. So that'll be great to see that in the response to that list of issues when we get that from the Tunisian authorities. And in Somalia, we raised issues of due process concerns, that sometimes people are executed within days of the court's verdict being handed down. And we expressed concern about the range of crimes that are eligible for the death penalty in Somalia. And the committee, in its concluding observations and recommendations, picked up on those issues, as you can see from what you have on your screen. So it's great to see that our advocacy is making a difference in terms of what the committee experts are saying and doing and writing as part of this periodic review process. If we weren't engaged, we don't know. As Katya said, for Egypt last time around, when we weren't involved in 2002, the death penalty wasn't in the concluding observations and recommendations at all. So if we're not talking about it, it's possible that the committee experts won't talk about it either. And so it's really important that we get our foot in the door, submit these reports, do this advocacy so that the death penalty can be on the agenda. So governments know that they're not just going to be able to get away with it, that if they're going to meet with the Committee Against Torture and they have the death penalty, they're going to hear about it from the committee experts, and the committee experts are going to make recommendations. So they're going to keep feeling that pressure from the human rights experts in Geneva. So that's what we have for you, and we have time for questions. So maybe we'll leave this up on the screen in case anyone wants to jot down our email addresses or reach out and or find the link for our toolkit, Human Rights Tools for a Changing World. We have a chapter on UN advocacy if you want to learn more. We also welcome you to volunteer to write reports on the death penalty for the Committee Against Torture or for other treaty bodies or other UN mechanisms. We can always use pro bono assistance in preparing these reports, and you can see they make a difference. They do have an effect on what happens at Geneva, and the pressure that governments feel to move toward abolition of the death penalty, and on other issues as well, including gender-based violence, domestic violence, LGBTIQ+ rights, and a variety of other issues. We just submitted reports to the UN Human Rights Committee about human rights issues in the United States, including human trafficking, gender-based violence, and the death penalty. And I'll be in Geneva next week for that actual in-person review to do that lobbying with the committee experts. So it's a really exciting way to see how the international human rights community can help press governments to respect human rights. So we can take down the screen and leave it up for folks to ask questions if they want. And you can just unmute yourself and chat. It's not a big group. And if you want to know what happens with Egypt, you can follow the Advocates for Human Rights on social media. I'm sure we will be sharing those concluding observations and recommendations when they come out. And it's a great way to see the impact of the work that our wonderful pro bono attorneys are doing, and our staff working on this, and our partners as well. It really, really is rewarding to see all of that happen. Great question from Kent Ritchie. Does the U.S. respond appropriately to recommendations? So as you might expect, it depends a bit on what the administration is that's involved with engaging with the UN. And, you know, implementation of the recommendations isn't perfect. Sometimes the United States government will say, we just disagree with your reading of what the treaty says. So, for example, the Human Rights Committee, I have that on my mind because that review is coming up next week. The Human Rights Committee has a lot of concerns about the treatment of people in Guantanamo, the people who've been held there now for decades. And the government's position, including under the current government, is that that's sort of outside the jurisdiction of the treaty body. And so even if the Human Rights Committee makes recommendations on that point, the government will just say, we disagree with your views on the treaty, we're not going to do it. In other respects, the treaty body experts will make recommendations, and there will be some follow-up, some effort to implement, usually not perfect, but there will be, they will listen, and they will generally do something, or they will explain why they can't. Like with the death penalty in the United States, there is a federal death penalty, and certainly the administration could institute a formal moratorium on executions, which they have not, and stop pursuing the death penalty at the federal level, which they have not, could encourage the Congress to abolish the death penalty at the federal level, which they've encouraged, but they haven't taken any steps. But in terms of states, the federal government can't make states abolish the death penalty. And so they'll say, well, we can't do that. So next question, have you seen any shifts in societal views globally or nationally in the US on abolishing the death penalty recently? Yeah, there's been a big uptick of countries abolishing the death penalty, especially on the African continent. So most recently, Sierra Leone in 2021, Zambia in 2022, Ghana is just on the verge of abolishing the death penalty. Parliament has passed the law and it's just awaiting the president's signature. So there's been good progress. Malaysia has made progress in getting rid of the mandatory death penalty and really reducing the scope of the death penalty. We're seeing a lot of progress, and every other year when there are the votes in the UN General Assembly, every other year there's been an increase, there's been an uptick in the number of countries voting in favor of that resolution. So that shows there is actually growing global support for abolishing the death penalty. Let's see. I represent some Ethiopians in asylum cases. Can I get copies of your reports to the experts? Yeah, Katya, maybe you can put in, or did you already put in the link? Yeah, all the reports. So if you go to our UN reports page and you go to the bottom and it says view all, you can select the country. And so you can select Ethiopia and see all of the reports we've submitted on Ethiopia. They're there for you to use. You're welcome to them. Other questions? We're at 1 minute past the hour. Again, and if you want to learn more, get involved, feel free to reach out to me or to Katya or to Robin, our executive director, who's on the who's on the screen right now. And we thank you for taking the time out of your day to learn more about the Advocates for Human Rights and its work and our efforts to abolish the death penalty around the world. It's really exciting to be a part of World Day Against the Death Penalty. I should say I chair the World Coalition's World Day Against the Death Penalty Working Group. So it's really exciting to finally be at this day that we've been working on all year long. So thank you for being part of World Day Against the Death Penalty and for learning a little bit more about the theme of torture and the death penalty.
Thank you.
Thank you.